Good evening, everyone. Welcome to lesson 4 of Outsmarting Anti-Semitism. Up until now, we discussed the background of it, how we are supposed to approach it as Jews, and particularly how it pertains to the Holy Land and how should we counter it. Today, we're going to focus on something more niche, something more narrow focused, and that is how do we deal with people in the public arena who aren't anti-Semites, or perhaps we don't know, not people who are the extreme. We're not talking about notorious anti-Semites like Hitler, may his name be erased, and those of his ilk. But we're talking about people, government officials, celebrities, journalists, people who are in positions of influence, and they don't publicly proclaim their disdain for all Jews, but they deny they're anti-Semites, and they do things or don't do things, say things or don't say things, however politely or not politely, that undermine our interests. Perhaps a university president who doesn't do enough to counter anti-Semitism on campus, or a local politician who's not quick enough to call out anti-Semitism, or various other concerns and situations, and we can all think of someone. And perhaps it'll help if you jot down on page 114, in the 4 categories, a famous individual, living individual, who they embrace opinions that seem to be harmful to Jews in our opinions. We won't mention these names outside, but jot down someone in journalism, entertainment, politics, academia, who we feel take a position that is harmful to the Jewish people, although they claim to be philo-Semites or at least non-anti-Semitic. And the question is, these people do shape public discourse regarding anti-Semitism. They shape public opinion, and we know that they're detrimental to our interests, Jewish people in general, not particularly with regard to Israel, but in any shape or form with regards to the Jewish people, including Israel. And the question is, what can we do about it? And I'm going to highlight a specific instance that will give us some insight into what we are talking about. During the 1950s and 60s, the French government was the primary supplier of Israeli weapons. France, they were very helpful, and they were the primary supplier. Came 1967, and Charles de Gaulle imposed an embargo upon the Jewish country, upon Israel, and upon its oppressors, people involved in the immediate Middle East warfare. And the idea of the embargo was, officially, it was just not to get involved, not to take sides in the fighting, but observers agreed that this move was really intended to boost the French relations with the Arab countries who were hostile to Israel. And it's very simple. They saw that it's more lucrative to be involved with the Arab countries as it was to be involved with the state of Israel. And as a result, France even refused to send already purchased jets. Israel had purchased, prior to this embargo, 50 Mirage jets from France, and France refused to fill that order, which was already purchased by Israel. But it got worse. It got worse because in 1970, during the War of Attrition, which was a war that was fought by Egypt, it was kind of subtle. It was with mortar shellings across the canal. It was trying to be a constant nuisance to Israel, to wear them down. It wasn't an all-out war. And it went on for quite a long time until there was a ceasefire agreed in August of 1970. And so it was during this backdrop of the War of Attrition that President, I'm going to mispronounce his name, I think, Pompidou, I think that's how it's pronounced, He announced that France will not only seemingly go against the embargo, but he announced that they're going to sell 15 Mirage jets to Libya. Libya was a sworn enemy of Israel, and he continued the arms embargo against Israel while selling the same 50 jets that he refused to give to Israel. He sold them to Libya. And it's an interesting excerpt from an article in the New York Times at the time, January 10th, 1970, that points out this uncomfortable situation between Israel and France. The same type of planes that were supposed to be given to Israel were sold to Libya. The official excuse of France at the time was that it's not, Libya isn't in direct conflict with Israel. The arms embargo is still on Egypt, it's still on Syria, it's still on Jordan, those countries that are directly involved, still on Lebanon. But Libya is a little bit detached, they're distant, they're not directly involved. It's solely to boost their own defense, and it's not to get involved in the war with Israel. Now, being an outside observer, being a later observer, here we are many, many years later. And let's think back. What would you do? How would you respond in 1970? Say you were there at the time. What would be your response? What do you feel should be the proper response of the Jewish community at the time? And it's not something theoretical. It's something real, because shortly after that situation, President or Prime Minister Pompidou arrived in the United States. The American Jews are now at the scene. Pompidou is arriving in the United States. What should the response of the American Jews be to that situation? They continue the embargo against Israel, and at the same time, they're selling the same 50 Mirage jets. And if I'm not mistaken, it went up. They actually sold 110 Mirage jets to Libya, a sworn enemy of Israel. Now let's hold that thought for a minute. And we're going to circle back to that specific story. The Jewish people have been dealing with this type of question for many, many years. And so we're going to do what Jews do at every single time, and that is, let's turn to Torah and see what Torah says on this subject, some Torah sources on this subject, and not just any Torah subject, but one that we're actually about to study in the Torah portion in the upcoming weeks. And that is the famous rivalry between Jacob and his twin brother Esau. They were twin brothers, but they couldn't have been more different. Jacob was a man of the tens. He would study Torah. He dedicated his life to the moral living of Torah and of godliness. And Esau was a hunter who put expediency and pleasure before all. He hated his brother. He hated Jacob. Not only that, but he swore to kill his brother Jacob, which caused Jacob in last week's Torah portion to flee his hometown of Beersheba and go to Haran, where he remained for 20 years. And that's where he married. He built up his family. Most of the 12 tribes were born. In essence, he's living in hiding, running away from his brother, his enemy, who has sworn to kill him. The story continues that Jacob is headed back to Israel. And he sends messengers to go find out what's his brother's feelings now. 20 years have passed, 20, 30, 35. Many years have passed, decades have passed. And what's his brother's feelings now for him? And they come back with a terrible report. Not only are his brother's feelings the same, he wants to kill him, he's actually heading towards Jacob to greet him, but not greet him in the nice fashion, but to greet him with 400 men armed to the teeth to wipe him out. Antisemitism at its best. He's going to wipe out his brother Jacob, a real enemy. What was Jacob's response? Let's look at page 19, text 2. Jacob prepared himself for a three-pronged response. What was a three-pronged response? A prayer, a gift, and an armed struggle. What was the theme of his gift? The theme of his gift was, in essence, the currency of the nomadic Canaanite people at the time. He was giving them cattle. He was giving them, he sent cattle ahead, and he sent the cattle, the sheep, the camels, the oxen, the donkeys. He divided it into several herds, and he sent one herd at a time, each one separately. And in this way, he hoped that Esau would receive each gift separately, and the emotional impact would be greater. Each delegation would arrive at Esau. Each delegation would come with a message that Yaakov, Jacob, your servant, would love to be received graciously. He wants to be on good terms, and he's giving you these gifts. And while that first group, leading the first herd of gifts, would be concluding their message, suddenly on the horizon would come the second group. And the same thing with the third group. He was sending gifts to his mortal enemy. Now, Yaakov, Jacob, was most likely not so excited to be involved in sending so many gifts to his sworn enemy who wants to kill him, who's leading 400 men. Who's leading 400 men to go ahead and kill him. He wasn't excited. Not only that, there must have been people, or it must have bothered him, that people will see that it's a sign of weakness. He's trying to give gifts to his enemy. You got to be strong. You got to be powerful. You got to show who you are. But that's not how he engaged. First and foremost, he prayed. He sent this gift. And he also prepared for armed struggle, but that was the last resort. He didn't feel weak. He didn't feel inferior to Esau. What he did do was, as we learned in lesson 1, he was creating a space for God's protection to be manifest. He knew that he's in God's hands, and it's God that commanded him that he should make a natural garment into which God can conceal his blessing. And so when you know that you're in Esau, not in Esau's hands, you're in God's hands, and you're just doing your part, your gestures, your gifts is just doing your part to create a garment through which God's protection can be manifest. You don't feel inferior to Esau. This was Yaakov's scheme, and guess what? It was effective. Text 3, what does the verse tell us? Esau ran toward Jacob and embraced him. He fell on Jacob's neck and kissed him, and they wept. They wept. He kissed him. Here he is with the 400 men. He's heading towards Jacob to kill him. And Jacob sends these gifts with messages. He's trying to arouse that emotional feeling. And he was successful. Esau meets him. He has this presentation of his family. He bows. He comes towards Esau. And Esau gives him this long lost brotherly hug and kiss. He was successful. The whole elaborate gift and heart-touching scene that was orchestrated by Jacob, it worked out. Did it convert Esau to become this loving brother once again, an ally of Jacob? Did they become chummy brothers once again? No, absolutely not. Not only that, even when he kissed them, it may have not been sincere. Let's take a look at this. This is an excerpt from a codex, but in the Torah scroll, it's exactly the same, minus the vowels. But if you look at this 2 columns, similar it looks like in the Torah scroll, it has the word vayishakehu, and he kissed him, right? The verse says, vayorat Esau, Esau runs towards Jacob. He falls on his neck, vayishakehu, and Esau kisses his brother Jacob. If you notice on top of this Hebrew word, vayishakehu, circled in red, there are dots on top of each letter. What are the dots on top of the letters? Even in the Torah scroll, where there are no vowels, there's no cantillation marks, there's no marks in a Torah scroll. The only marks that are there, rarely but occasionally, we have these dots above a word or above a letter. What do these dots symbolize? The dots symbolize, and is generally understood that when dots hover over a Torah word, it signals a minimizing. A minimizing related to the meaning of the word. It's minimizing the reading of the word in some form. Text 4. Leah, can you please read for us text 4 on page 120?
The Torah features, you said text 4, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. The Torah features dots over the words and kissed him. This is because Esau did not kiss Jacob wholeheartedly. Rabbi Shimon ben Yocha'i said, it is an established fact that Esau hates Jacob. Nevertheless, his compassion has moved at that time, and he kissed him wholeheartedly.
Thank you. However we look at it, whichever opinion we're going to follow, it's minimizing this brotherly kiss, either because he really didn't mean to kiss him. He was doing it because he was doing the motions, but he really hated him as he always did. And so that's what the dots are symbolizing, minimizing the meaning of the kiss, or it's minimizing the general rules. Rabbi Shimon bar Yocha'i, the famed sage Rabbi Shimon, who we've quoted many, many times, he says, no, it's minimizing the statements. There's a statement that it's an established fact that Esau hates Jacob. And by Esau hates Jacob, he doesn't only mean Esau, he means his kind of reincarnation in every generation. There's always the enemies that they're going to hate the Jewish people. But in this instance, that was minimized and he actually kissed him wholeheartedly. But it was just in this instance. In other words, his hatred continued even after this story. But what do we have from here? That the gift giving, it may have been temporary, but it was genuine. And even if it was feigned love, it was still there for that moment. And Jacob was successful in avoiding his demise, avoiding a war, avoiding a battle. And that's what he set out to do. And he was successful at that. What are we to take from this story? What we take from the story is as follows. The reason why the Torah tells us these stories of our ancestors is not just to tell us stories of the past, but it's really to tell us a symbol and a directive of how we ought to deal with similar situations. We ought to deal with our enemies in a similar fashion. What does this story teach us? Let's read text 5 on page 121. Rachel, can you please read for us text 5 on page 121?
Sure. That's fine. The Midrash relates, Bereshit Rabbah, that when Rabbi Yocha'i would set out for a meeting with the Roman government, he would first read this passage in the Torah regarding Jacob and Esau. The sages had a tradition that this passage was a guide for our exile. Therefore, when Rabbi Yocha'i would visit the rulers of Rome for communal issues, he would consult this passage to follow the advice of the wise Jacob. It is indeed appropriate for all generations to study his approach and to adopt it in actual practice.
Thank you. So this is Nachmanides, the famed 13th century sage, who's telling us that we ought to use this story as a guidebook on how to deal with our enemies. As a matter of fact, Rabbi Yocha'i, who was a great Talmudic sage, he would read this story every time he would go to Rome for communal affairs. This is how we deal with our enemies. Let's try to appease them with gifts before, again, this is not really enemies in this sense. We're going to use it for government officials that are kind of in that colorful space, somewhere in between the gray area. We're not talking about, more than likely, most of these ideas don't help us for our outright enemies, clear anti-Semites who want us dead. But for people like Rome, for dealing with local governments, for local officials who perhaps don't have our best interests in mind, who perhaps are not there to help us, Nachmanides says this: we ought to take the story of Jacob and his brother Esau to see what we can do. And what do we take from this story? There's many lessons that Rabbi Yanai could have taken from the story, but one central idea that throughout the ages, the Jewish people gleaned from the story was that they could and should try to influence the Esau's of their generations to gain from them concessions that would be beneficial from the Jew. A problematic Gentile is not someone that we have to fight with, nor is it someone that we have to cut off all ties with. Yes, they're problematic. Yes, they may be hateful. Yes, they may be doing things against us, but that's not what we ought to do. What we ought to do is look at the Torah story, and we should play our cards right to see if we can obtain these various privileges that are vital for Jewish survival. And just like Yaakov did in his instance, he didn't win over Esau, but he was successful in avoiding his demise, that battle, that war. There's many examples of this, and we'll begin with one in the Roman era, back in the 1st century, 2nd century, of Rabbi Shimon bar Yocha'i we just quoted, who says Esau hates Jacob. It's an established fact. And by Esau, the sages always understood the Roman Empire to be the heirs of Esau and his ilk, and the enemies of the Jewish people. Which leads us to the idea that let's analyze Rabbi Shimon's life. He knew good and well the evil that the Romans had perpetrated. He himself was a victim. He had once said something disparaging against the Roman Empire, and they wanted him dead. He had to hide for 13 years in a cave. 13 years. He knew good and well what suffering is under a regime that was anti-Semitic. Nonetheless, when it came to time, when Roman rulers of Judea passed a law banning certain Jewish practices, Rabbi Shimon was the one who was chosen to travel to Rome to win a concession and abolish this decree. Let's look at this Talmudic passage on text 6, page 122. The Roman government once issued a decree that Jews may not observe Shabbat, circumcision, and family purity. The Jews said to themselves, who should go to Rome to solicit annulment of the decree? Let Rabbi Shimon ben Yocha'i go, for he is experienced in miracles. And the Talmud continues to tell us the story. Rabbi Shimon accepted this task. He traveled to Rome. He made a positive impact, a positive impression on the emperor. The Talmud says that he miraculously healed the emperor's daughter, who was deathly sick at the time, and they tried all doctors and ways on how to heal her, and came Rabbi Shimon, and he miraculously healed the daughter. And he successfully had the emperor annul the decree. So yes, did he change the Roman emperor? No. Did he make that all of a sudden they became Philo-Semites? Absolutely not. But you know what he did get? He got what he wanted. He got that decree annulled. And this model continued throughout the generations. The court Jews, as you see on page 123, there were many, many court Jews, some that are mentioned here and some that are not mentioned here. Throughout the ages, there were many famous court Jews who that was their mission. Not to combat, not to wage war, public discourse against them, calling people out. On the contrary, to work behind the scenes diplomatically and try to win concessions, which they did successfully. And one of the most famous of these, what were called shtadlanim. Shtadlanim means advocates. One of the most famous advocates was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yosef of Roshheim. He lived in the beginning of the 16th century in Vienna, and he advocated on behalf of German Jewry in the courts of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and his grandson Charles V. Now, these two rulers were no Jew lovers. They ruled over Spain at the time of the Inquisition, so in effect, they were the ones causing the Inquisition to continue. Beginning in 1510, I believe, is when they took over from Queen Ferdinand. Charles was a grandchild of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel. And so they were no Jew lovers, to say the least. But nonetheless, there was a situation time and time again where Yosef of Roshheim would actually go and advocate on behalf of the Jewish people, and he was successful. On behalf of the German Jews, that is, and he was successful. He didn't go out calling them out that they're anti-Semites and no one should talk to them and no one should look at them. He worked in the path that Jacob did. And here's how he writes in his memoirs on page 124, text 7. Shmuel, can you read for us? Sorry, not Shmuel. Let's see, who else? All right, I'll read. Text 7. In 5031, the denouncers once again hounded the Emperor Charles V while he was in Belgium and Holland, lands uninhabited by Jews. Now, who are the denouncers? It's a question. It's not so clear who the denouncers, but it seems like these were people who tried to undermine the single thing that the Jews were permitted to do at the time, which was money lending, and they were trying to get the king to issue a decree not allowing the Jews to do money lending and to revoke all debts that were owed to Jews. They should all be revoked. And so the denouncers, the anti-Semites, were hounding Charles V when he was in Belgium. Rabbi Yosef of Rosheim writes further, many requested that I travel to those lands to oppose the accusers with the help of God. I was at the court of the exalted emperor for 4 months, from the 1st of Adar until the 1st of Sivan, pursuing the interests of the Jewish communities. Although Rothroyd, who was a notorious anti-Semite at the time, attempted to swallow me alive and to bring about my demise, literally tried to kill him, God in his great mercy sent his messenger and saved me from his hands and from all those who sought to harm me. At that time, I had an audience with the emperor in his private chamber. I spoke to him for as long as I needed, and he responded sympathetically. During this period, when I had free time and was secluded in my room, I authored a book titled The Sanctified Path. He was secluded in his room for 4 months because those countries were anti-Semitic. He was surrounded by anti-Semites. The emperor was no lover of the Jews. He was overseeing the Inquisition. Rabbi Yosef of Rosheim was successful in his mission, which was to save the German Jewry from that specific issue that was happening. And he did it in a diplomatic fashion. What concessions he gave to the emperor, we don't know. He doesn't write about it. That was his goal, the survival of German Jewry, and he was successful. He wasn't looking to bestow the righteous Gentile name on King Charles V. That wasn't his goal. He wasn't looking to change King Charles. What he was looking was to ensure the survival of the German Jewish community, and he was successful at it. Now, this model doesn't always work. Trying to work behind the scenes diplomatically. The picture in 4.2 is a painting about the famed court Jew, the great sage, great rabbi, in the time of the expulsion in 1492, Don Yitzchak Abar Benel, a great sage whom we've quoted many, many times in various classes. And he was a court Jew of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And he tried. And try as he might, he was not successful. He even offered, as he writes, he offered a vast sum of gold in return for the decree's annulment. But he was not successful. So there were times when Shtadlanus, when this advocacy was successful, and there were times when it didn't work. But what is true is that this approach is very effective and was very effective on many, many occasions. Now, perhaps this looks like that the Jewish people are begging. Perhaps this looks like that we need to weaken ourselves in order to be at the mercy of these Jewish leaders. But the reality is that's not what it's about. Because as we explained earlier, what it was about is the idea that we are doing our part. We know that Esau, we know that these government leaders are not who is in control. We know that God's in control. And being that God's in control, we have to make that garment to allow God's blessing to be manifested in a natural way. And so by going to plead with the authority or to work diplomatically behind the scenes with the authority of the time, with a person of power, be it an actor, be it a entertainer, a journalist, a government official, whoever it may be, by working behind the scenes to them, it's not cowering to them. It's not weakening ourselves. It's allowing God to bring his blessings to that situation. It's making that garment to allow God's blessings in. So we don't feel inferior, we feel empowered, because this is what God wants us to do. So what are we saying essentially? We're saying that we can get good things done from people who dislike us. And the question really is that possible? These people dislike us, perhaps they even hate us. Is it possible for them to do good? All of a sudden they like us. Maybe they have something deep down that they'd like to accomplish. Maybe there's something that they want in return for this small deed that they're doing for us. Maybe we're getting something done in return, because ultimately they do hate us. And so modern science, and I'm not a scientist, so I don't fully understand this idea, but I figured it was I was going to skip it, but I figured it's an important idea. And it sounds interesting, so I'll mention it in passing. Modern science presents an interesting idea, and we'll see that on page 128, which was something that was written following the story of Mel Gibson and his statement against the Jewish people in 2006, his racial slurs, his anti-Semitic slurs, and his latter apology, his apology that came after that. And so based on that situation that occurred in 2006, there was a neuroscientist who presented an interesting idea. And we'll see that on page 128 and 129, text 8. Leah, can you please read for us text 8a and 8b?
Brains are like representative democracies.
What?
They are built of multitude overlapping experts who weigh in and compete over different choices. There's an ongoing conversation among the different fractions in your brain, each competing to control the single output channel of your behavior. When the hostess at the party offers chocolate cake, you find yourself on the horns of a dilemma. Some parts of your brain have evolved to crave the rich energy source of the sugar, and other parts care about the negative consequences, such as the health of your heart. Part of you wants the cake, and part of you tries to muster the fortitude to forego it. The final vote of the parliament determines which party controls your action. That is whether you put your hand up or out. As the French whatever that is, Michael put it, there is much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others. Team of rivals. Returning to Mel Gibson and his drunken tirade, we can ask whether there is such a thing as true colors. We have seen the behavior is the outcome of the battle among internal systems. To be clear, I'm not defending Gibson's despicable behavior, but I am saying that a team of rival brains can naturally harbor both racist and non-racist feelings. Alcohol is not a truth serum. Instead, it tends to tip the battle toward the short-term unreflective fraction, which is no more or less claimed than any other fraction to be a true one.
Thank you. The human brain isn't unidimensional. Yes, there's hate there, but that's not necessarily the person. That's one dimension of the person. And so what we have to attempt to do, and the idea that we learned from these courtiers who took a page out of Jacob and Esau's story, is let's tap into the good side of those people. So we can say that it's not every cell of Esau's brain that hated Jacob. There was hate there, and perhaps in his situation quite prominently, but it doesn't mean it's omnipresent. And so that's what Jacob was attempting to do, tapping into that part of his brain that the hate isn't there. Let that little part, and maybe for a little bit, it may be feigned love, it may be something which is insignificant and insincere, but for this purpose, it's tremendously significant. Jewish people, the court Jews, attempted to create throughout the generations the right circumstances to help a different subset of voices, whether voices within the leader at the time or voices within the communal leadership at the time, to be what's good for the Jewish people. Now, obviously, we live today in a different world than those people lived in at that time, different world than Jacob and Esau. Our ancestors didn't have a choice between gifts and war. Usually the only choice they had was gifts. What are they going to wage war against who? They were going to wage war against King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. So they didn't have that choice. The only choice they had was to have a courtier, someone who's going to advocate for them. Right? What was Yosef of Rushheim's options? Did he have arranged a mass demonstration outside of the palace? Absolutely not. He'd lose his head for that. Now we live in a different world. We can arrange demonstrations against anti-Semites. We can call them out. We can do mass advertisements. We can do press releases. We can attack these people who say an anti-Semitic statement and call them out as anti-Semites. We could do that. And it's done. We can cancel the haters. We can shame them into silence. And that's actually what happens, getting back to the story in 1970. When Pompidou came to the United States in 1970, he was met with fierce demonstrations. As a matter of fact, as you see in text 9, again, another article from the New York Times, page 131, President Nixon made a hurried trip to New York yesterday to apologize to President Pompidou, who was angered by what he termed insults to himself and his wife during pro-Israeli demonstrations touched off by his state visit to the United States. The French president had been angered by a jostling that members of his party received from demonstrators in Chicago, whose actions were marked by boos and angry cries, and by what he viewed as acceptance of such hostile acts by the Chicago police. So unlike our ancestors, we can go to war, not literal war, but vocal demonstration. We can go a vocal war against our opponents. Is this something that we should do? But we look at the story with Jacob and we see he had the option of war. It was there, it was on the table, it was something, a contingency he planned for, but he left it for last. And with regard to this story, the story of Pompidou, the Rebbe addressed the story. And the Rebbe said something fascinating. Let's read it on page 132, text 10a. Rachel, can you please read for us? Page 132, 10a.
Sure. At what cost? The public protests against the president of France angered French officials. This blocked any lobbying efforts that French Jews might have been able to make to prevent or at least reduce French assistance to Arab countries that are hostile to Israel. The stated reason for these protests was to demonstrate that America is a democratic country and American Jews are not cowardly. This is a worthwhile objective when Jewish lives are not at risk. However, when Jews are threatened with the sale of many military jets to Libya, we have two options. We can organize public protests, or we can make every effort to either prevent or postpone the sale, reduce the number of jets sold, or to at least prevail upon the French to send less effective planes. Such aims can only be achieved through quiet diplomacy. The proof is that agreements of this nature have been reached in the past.
Now here the Rebbe doesn't clarify what he's referring to by past agreements, but in a year later, the Rebbe said as follows, page 134. When Mr. Pompidou visited the United States, there were mass protests against him intended to intimidate France. This effort backfired. It can now be said that despite the French embargo against selling arms to belligerents in the Middle East, the French president had allowed the sale of small arms and light weapons to Israel, items that can be sold without attracting publicity. However, as a result of the demonstrations, the approval for such sales was withdrawn. After some time, when he was no longer being disparaged, he resumed dealing with Jews behind closed doors and reinstituted the small arms sales. He also arranged for 300 Jews to be able to leave Egypt. All of this was accomplished without demonstrations and without publicity. The Israeli media was warned against disclosing any of this, and we only know of this from the non-Israeli press. The conclusion we must draw from this case is that we do not influence anti-Semites by constantly yelling at them, you are an anti-Semite, you're a thief, you're a murderer. Rather, engage them in diplomatic conversation. Although such individuals are well aware of what we think about them, they are nevertheless human beings and wish to behave like human beings. In this example, the Rebbe is telling us clearly, quiet diplomacy actually worked with regard to the story of Pompidou. It worked. He agreed, despite the embargo, to sell small arms to Israel. And because of the demonstrations, because of the war, public war, calling him out as an anti-Semite, calling him out, he canceled it. It backfired. And only when that subsided is when he reinstituted that sale of small arms. And there's another famous example, and I don't remember this, but perhaps some of you do. Jesse Helms. Who remembers, by raise of hand, Senator Jesse Helms of South Carolina? Right. Initially, he was known as a notorious anti-Semite. He always voted against Israel and he voted to stop giving any financial assistance to Israel. And he was one of those senators notorious for being against Israel. And what happened? He even went so far after the First Lebanon War in 1982, he voted that the United States should break off all relations with Israel. That's how far he went. In 1984, Chabad held an event in Washington, D.C., and the event was celebrating the fact that President Reagan and both houses of Congress designated the Rebbe's birthday as Education Day USA, which parenthetically is still Education Day USA until today. Every year, it's the only holiday, so to speak. It isn't a bank holiday, but it's the only holiday in the United States that follows the Hebrew calendar. Every year on the 11th of Nisan is proclaimed as Education Day USA by every subsequent president. It began with President Reagan. And so in 1984, when it began, Chabad organized a celebration in Washington, D.C., and Senator Jesse Helms was one of the high-profile attendees at this celebration. And Chabad got backlash. Chabad got backlash from inviting this famously or infamously anti-Israel senator. And as a matter of fact, Professor Alan Dershowitz, he read about this and he wrote a letter to the Rebbe complaining and objecting to Lubavitch Chabad honoring Jesse Helms, considering his voting record being so anti-Semitic. So the Rebbe replied, this event is not honoring Jesse Helms. It's honoring the fact that President Reagan is creating Education Day USA. And as a matter of fact, by Senator Helms coming to this event, he is the one who is honoring and paying tribute to Chabad's commitment to education. But what's perhaps more important is the postscript to that letter. This letter from 1984. Text 11. The letter from the Rebbe, the postscript of the letter to Professor Alan Dershowitz. And here's what the Rebbe writes. I trust you will agree that in regard to persons of influence, whether in Washington or elsewhere, the first objective should be to persuade and encourage such a person to use his influence in a positive way in behalf of any and all good causes which are important to us. We should welcome every public appearance which lends public support to the cause, especially when there is a likelihood that it may be the forerunner of similar pronouncements in the future. And the Rebbe continues, my experience with such people, though I have never personally met the said person, Jesse Helms, has convinced me that politicians are generally motivated more by expediency than by conviction. In other words, their public pronouncements on various issues do not stem from categorical principles or religious imperatives. Hence, most of them, if not all, are subject to change in their position depending on time, place, or other factors. I believe, therefore, that the proper approach to such persons by Jewish leaders should not be rigid. As a rule, it does no good to engage in a Cold War which may often turn into a hot war, nor does it serve any useful purpose to brand one as an enemy or an anti-Semite. However tempting it is to do so, even if that person vehemently denies it. It can only be counterproductive. On the contrary, ways and means should be found to persuade such a person to take a favorable stance, at least publicly. We having too many friends and attaching labels, etc., will not gain us any. Instances abound where the approach advocated above produced good results. And the Rebbe mentioned here about the moral majority and Jerry Falwell Sr., and with regard to his unfavorable comments to Israel, and then slowly as the Israeli government gave him gifts and he became a staunch supporter of Israel. There's surely no need to point out to you that responsible Jewish leaders consistently cultivated good public relations, indeed even cordial relations, with President Carter and his predecessors going back to President Roosevelt, regardless of their sometimes openly negative feelings towards Jews and Jewish causes. And what happened? Subsequent to this letter, Professor Dershowitz recounts the story and this letter that he received from the Rebbe, and then he says as follows. Sure enough, very shortly after Jesse Helms was honored, and again, the Rebbe pointed out that he wasn't honored, but these are the words of Professor Dershowitz, Senator Helms assumed a very influential role in the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee and became one of the strongest supporters of Israel and of other Jewish causes as well. So obviously, continues Professor Dershowitz, the Rebbe had an enormous influence on persuading Jesse Helms that even with his very conservative values, he could become a beacon for the Jewish people and the Jewish state. That's Professor Dershowitz's suggestion. We don't precisely know why Senator Helms changed his stance on Israel. He never publicly said so, to the best of my knowledge. But the reason why he changed his mind is less significant than the fact that he actually did, because the important lesson here remains the same, remains to be optimistic, and we can get important things done even from people who dislike us. If we play our cards right, we may even inspire enduring change, as it was in the case of Jesse Helms. He became a staunch supporter. It may not work all the time, this approach, but it sure does much of the time. And so going out there, practically speaking, now before the era of Mashiach, when all our haters at that time in the era of Mashiach, as we quoted Maimonides a number of times, and Maimonides says that the wolf will lie with the lamb is a reference to the idea that all anti-Semites will be gone, and they'll suddenly, all anti-Semitic feelings will be gone. But until that point, when we still have haters and government officials or people in important positions who do things or say things that harm the Jewish people or the Holy Land, the way we ought to go about it is the way Jacob taught us with Esau. Go gifts before war. Do our best to try to tap into their emotional side. And when we do that, we most likely will be successful. At least let's begin with that attempt. Give it our best effort. And we do know that we shouldn't feel belittled, as we mentioned either, with trying to go this route. It's not showing that we're weaker. It's not showing that we're powerless. On the contrary, what we're doing is doing our part to allow God's blessings to flourish. This idea is perhaps for Jewish leadership, for Jewish organizations, taken a page out of the Torah when it comes to the response to such people. But it has a lesson for us as well. It has a lesson for individuals, not in leadership positions, because we all have our sphere of influence. We all have that guy, that worker, that neighbor, that classmate, the person we met the other time, that we're quick to call them out an anti-Semite because they said this or they did this, and they may have said or done something which is anti-Semitic. They may have said or done something which was wrong for the Jewish people. And they may have done it more than once. And they may have done it unknowingly or knowingly. But by calling them out, by going that route of the war, the Cold War, that's detrimental. It exasperates the problem. And it leads to a Cold War, which can lead ultimately to a hot war. So the message that we take from this is, let's not be quick to render such verdicts. Just because a person hates you doesn't mean that all we can experience from them is hate. If we set the stage properly, we can have positive experience for them as well. Which leads us to a second important point, and that is understanding the complexity of the human brain. Understanding this idea, as we mentioned, quoted earlier from that neuroscientist, that there are those different parts of the brain. Just because someone is a philo-Semite today, just because someone is a friend of the Jewish people today, doesn't mean it'll be that way always. Doesn't mean he can't be influenced and he can't be changed to start doing things against the Jewish people. And so we don't put our trust in our friends or our allies, we put our trust in God. And this is why we must do everything to ensure that the conditions in our society are as conducive as possible towards bringing out what's good in people, rather than the more sinister angles of people's character. Because everyone has those aspects. We have to do our part to bring out the best in people. And in the area of education, that means to ensure that education is not just about academics, but rather education is about proper character traits, self-discipline, good morals, ethics, and so on. Education for ourselves, education for those we come in contact with, and education us as a society in general. It should not be focused on only academics. A comprehensive plan has to be made to teach proper morals, ethics, and virtues that will yield these positive results of having people focus on the positive aspects of life, the good in themselves and in others, rather than the sinister parts. I'm going to share a video, a clip that presents this idea beautifully.
Negative thoughts, actions, and speech create negative energy. Conversely, positive thoughts, actions, and speech create positive energy. And that's what led, with an idea that has its genesis in South Africa, to the idea of ARK, acts of random kindness. You see, this is kind of shaped a little bit, more or less, if you use your imagination, like Noah's Ark. And the idea is, you take some change, you place it in here, and when it's filled up, we pass it along to someone who's less fortunate. It isn't just the money collected, it's the thought and the feeling that it represents.
So I went to a public school. I studied math and physics, and we studied how to solve math problems. I didn't know how to solve my own problems.
Rabbi David Aaron, a Jerusalem-based educator, reflects on his personal experience.
The real problems of life is what education should be focusing on. It's essentially about building people, and only great people will do great things.
It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Mr. President.
On March 30th, 1981, then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, delivered a luncheon address at the Washington Hilton.
Thank you very much.
He left the hotel at 2:27 p.m., but as he headed to his limousine, a would-be assassin opened fire. Reagan was critically wounded, and the nation collectively gasped in horror. The president survived, and at a public gathering 2 weeks later, the Lubavitcher Rebbe insisted that the instructive lesson of the assassination attempt must similarly survive. The Rebbe saw the event as a wake-up call for the nation to upgrade its approach to education.
So dort der Chok Medina mit darf gehen in a Beis Sefer. In der Beis Sefer meyusod und durchgenommen. A was darf geben a Beis Sefer darf geben Jidis. Nicht darf ausformen, aufton, aufmachen. Dem Jeser Leib Hodom, als soll sein mit Midis Tevis. Und soll wissen, als stark, als geht und lernt in dem Beis Sefer. Aber der Riker lernen seiner ist, was zum Ton Teva rumsich. Und das ist der Teva Amiti für sich. Und das ist in ganzen Nitereien in der Tochnis und in der Programm von Beis Sefer.
As much as we want to graduate mathematicians and scientists, we also want to graduate decent human beings.
Dr. Rona Novick, Dean of the Israeli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration, has given ample thought to this problem.
Very few educators would invite a charismatic speaker or have a big assembly program to create readers. They would understand that the way that we build reading skills is piece by piece and building block by building block. We start in kindergarten and first grade and we keep building on it. Well, we need to look at character education and social emotional learning in exactly the same way.
Judaism teaches us that it's important to give charity every day. And the more you give charity, that muscle of kindness within you gets stronger and stronger.
Rabbi Levi Greenberg and his wife Shana are emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in El Paso, Texas.
We embarked on a campaign to bring this message of daily giving to every single child in El Paso. And so we brought to El Paso the ARC campaign. All the children in the school received one of these boxes, and they were told that the purpose of this box is to be taken home and filled every day. If they have extra coins, they should ask their parents for some money. After a month of collecting money, their class would nominate charities that should receive their combined money. And the winning charity would receive the combined monies that they had collected throughout that month. The ARC project, giving money every day, takes acts of random kindness and turns them into acts of routine kindness.
Raising a generation of individuals empowered with a sense of purpose and trained to pursue acts of kindness is an important factor in curing and preventing numerous social ills, including the reduction of hate and bigotry, along with anti-Semitism.
The more we give, the more we respect. We respect human life, we respect property, the more dignity we have for ourselves and for society. If we want to stop anti-Semitism, we have to stop hatred. And we have the opportunity to nip hatred in the bud by increasing in acts of goodness and kindness and inspiring and encouraging all of humanity to do so. Every single person should give charity every day, and hatred will be a thing of the past.
The call of the hour, more necessary than ever, is for each of us to adopt a charity box for regular, daily contributions, and to encourage all around us, family and friend, Jew and non-Jew, to act similarly. Actively demonstrate, encourage, and promote kindness, sympathy, and altruistic care. If a little illumination eliminates a lot of darkness, think of what a rapidly swelling force of systematic goodness can achieve for our communities, and ultimately for humanity. It's time to turn up the light.
We'll reach a point, God willing, soon with the coming of Mashiach, where Esau and our enemies will no longer be coming to give us these fake kisses and these short-term goals, but they'll be gone forever. But until that point, until the point when the lamb will lie with the wolf and they'll get along, we have to make sure, as we discussed in these 4 lessons, to remain calm, because we know that we're trusting in God. And so we're going to upgrade our connection with God. We'll create natural means through which God can provide our security, because that's what God wants from us. We won't internalize anti-Semitism by altering our Jewish heritage, but rather we will be open with our Jewish identity, which benefits Jews, and it also fosters diversity of all minorities. We'll share awareness of God's mission for all humanity and thereby help individuals avoid experiencing an inner void by teaching of the 7 Noahide laws, as we explained in the ditch theory. We'll thank God for the divine gift of the Holy Land and seek to strengthen its security and prosperity. And we do that by knowing that God is the one who gave us the land of Israel. And we're going to avoid labels and public shaming. Instead, we're going to work with whomever we can to ensure beneficial results for the Jewish people. That's how we deal with these famous and great people who do these types of things. And there's one more thing that I'd like to end off with. Today's lesson, and perhaps the prior 4 lessons, were about how do we deal with non-Jews? How do we deal with non-Jews who show us anti-Semitism? But the question is, how do we relate to each other within the Jewish community? What does that have to do with anti-Semitism? What does that have to do with this course? We're going to go back to the story of Purim. What happened in the story of Purim? The first complaint that Haman, the evil one, had for the Jewish people, towards Achashverosh, Haman said as follows. It's in page 140. There is one nation that is scattered and dispersed among the nations throughout all the countries of your empires. What's Haman telling Achashverosh? He's trying to convince the king that these are bad people and they're going to go against you and they don't help, they're not beneficial to society. Get rid of them. Isn't the fact that they're spread and they're dispersed throughout all his empire, which was 127 countries, doesn't it show how weak they are, how they're never going to be able to overpower him or they're never going to be able to go against him? What Haman was telling Achashverosh is that their lack of unity is what's leaving them vulnerable. You have no reason to fear that the Jews can overcome my plot to annihilate them, Haman is telling Achashverosh, because their lack of unity has left them vulnerable. They're divided against themselves, says the Rebbe. This is what Haman was saying. They don't follow their leaders. They're not able to develop a cohesive strategy. They don't get along with each other. And therefore, they're never going to be able to accomplish of going against us. And therefore, how did the Jewish people respond? In this time of Haman, they responded by a great show of Jewish unity. Mordechai gathered all the Jewish people. They prayed together, they helped each other, and as a matter of fact, that's what was instituted for years to come until this day. What do we do on Purim to commemorate the miracle? We bring food baskets to each other. We give charity because we demonstrate that it's a mutual love, Jewish unity, that was the cause of our deliverance. When there's disunity, we cannot present a united front. But the Rebbe takes it a step further. Hasidic thought tells us that the only way we can receive the divine blessing is, as we say in the prayers every single day, Barchenu Avinu Kulanu Ke'echad, bless us, our Father, because we are all as one. When do we receive God's blessings? When we have Jewish unity, when we have mutual love and respect for each one. When we have that, that's when God's blessings flow. And as we mentioned various times throughout the course, it's all dependent on God's blessings. The more we are unified, the more we respect each other, the more blessings we have from the Almighty. We may not be able to control outside. We can do certain things, certain steps. We may not be able to control what others do to us, but we can definitely control how we interact with each other. And when we have unity, when we have togetherness, then God will smile down upon us and shower us with his blessing of protection, of goodness, and with the ultimate blessing of the coming of Mashiach. May it be speedily in our times.
Lesson 4.
change of heart. 1. The Torah's narrative of Jacob and Esau suggests that by employing the right words and deeds, we can influence those we deem to be against us. Accordingly, the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon bar Yocha'i traveled to Rome to win concessions for the benefit of the Jewish community, establishing a model followed by countless others, most famously the European court Jews of the early modern period. 2. Jews did not feel inferior while conducting diplomatic missions. They knew that the Jewish future depended on God, and that their job was to generate a garment behind which God could conceal his blessings. A firm belief that they were in God's hands inspired in them a sense of pride. 3. According to modern neuroscience, brains are built of multiple parts that weigh in concerning different choices, each part competing to control the single output channel of behavior. This explains why an individual with Jewish friends can nevertheless carry out a drunken tirade against Jews. Conversely, it explains why Jews can gain assistance from unlikely sources. 4. Today, we are finally able to campaign publicly against those who oppose us. However, it is often counterproductive to publicly brand individuals as enemies or anti-Semites. Slow to shame and quick to engage is still an effective route. 5. We must do everything possible to condition society to bring out the best in people rather than their more sinister elements. In the sphere of education, this means promoting an approach that is not restricted to acquiring information, but rather includes proper character traits, self-discipline, and the awareness that all humans are created to actively generate goodness in their environments. 6. Living in harmony with our fellow Jews enables us to better collaborate to ward off threats and promote our interests. Jewish mysticism teaches that God responds positively to Jewish unity, providing overt blessings of protection and goodness.
Thank you all for joining. Please join us. The upcoming course, the winter course in the beginning of February. The Torah was given at Sinai, and so were the meditative tools to help us open up, see what's possible, and live deeply. This winter will begin the first week of February, meditation from Sinai, a course that teaches the what, how, why, where, and when of divine meditation, mindful awareness, and soulful transcendence.